Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking exactly how a newly independent India solved the absolutely massive puzzle of building its economic foundation from scratch. It's an incredible story, really. A nation charting its own entirely new course, trying to balance these huge, sky-high ambitions with incredibly limited resources. Here is our agenda for today. 1. A new economic dawn. 2. 5-year plan goals. 3. Reforming the land. 4. The Green Revolution. And 5. The subsidy debate. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. A New Economic Dawn.
So, picture August 15th, 1947. India is at a major crossroads. Prime Minister Nehru looked at pure purchasing power-driven capitalism, and then he looked at Soviet-style socialism, where the government dictates every single need, and he essentially said no thanks to both extremes. Instead, they built a mixed economy. Now, a massive piece of this puzzle was the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956, often just called IPR 1956. This policy was a total game changer. The state took the wheel on heavy industries, basically the commanding heights of the economy. The private sector was left to handle consumer goods, though, they were strictly regulated by the infamous licensing Raj. But here's something absolutely crucial: small-scale industries, or SSIs. The IPR 1956 heavily promoted and protected these smaller operations because they were the ultimate employment generators for everyday people.
Basically, this mixed economy was trying to thread the needle, combining the socialist ideal of government planning with the realities of private property and democratic freedom. To steer this massive new ship, the Planning Commission was set up in 1950, which officially kicked off the era of national planning.
Section 2. 5-year plan goals.
To actually pull off this grand vision, the country relied on 5-year plans, which were meticulously shaped by the brilliant statistician Persanta Chandra Mahalanobis. This quote right from the first 5-year plan is so foundational because it directly anchors all of his high-level math and economic theory to one single human goal: giving people the chance at a richer, more varied existence.
To achieve that richer life, the planners zeroed in on 4 core goals: growth, modernization, self-reliance, and equity. Now, balancing these 4, it was an unbelievably difficult job. Resources were tightly constrained, meaning that in every single 5-year window, planners had to make really tough choices about which goal got the spotlight, all while desperately trying not to let the other 3 collapse.
Let's break these down, starting with growth. A great way to think about gross domestic product, or GDP, is like a giant cake. Economic growth basically just means baking a bigger cake. If the cake is larger, more people can actually enjoy a slice. So in economic terms, we're talking about a steady, continuous increase in the country's capacity to produce goods and services.
Then we have modernization, which, interestingly, wasn't just about plugging in shiny new factory machines. It also meant upgrading traditional social outlooks. For example, recognizing that women should have the exact same rights as men, and actively bringing their talents into banks, factories, and schools to build a truly prosperous society.
Section 3. Reforming the land.
At independence, a staggering 75% of the population depended on agriculture. Yet the whole sector was completely trapped in stagnation. The root cause? A fundamentally broken land tenure system. You had intermediaries, like the zamindars, who just sat back and collected rent. And then you had the actual tillers, the ones sweating in the soil. The tillers had absolutely zero incentive to improve the farm, because they didn't get to keep the profits. It's a lot like the story of Soviet farmers from our source material, who would carelessly pack rotten fruits right in with the fresh ones. Why? Because without ownership, they suffered no losses and enjoyed no profits. Ultimately, ownership is what drives incentive.
To fix this massive bottleneck, India rolled out land reforms just a year after independence. By abolishing those intermediaries, an incredible 200 lakh tenants were freed. They were brought into direct contact with the government, and actually conferring ownership gave them the huge incentive they needed to finally start increasing agricultural output.
But hey, remember our 4 goals? While giving land to the tiller was great for growth, the equity goal was really struggling. So, the government introduced land ceilings to strictly limit how much land one single person could own, with the hope of distributing the leftover land to the landless. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that smoothly. Big landlords routinely dragged these rules into court. They used the endless delays to exploit legal loopholes, literally registering land to close relatives just to completely evade the ceiling.
It wasn't a total failure everywhere, though. Land reforms actually saw huge success in states like Kerala and West Bengal. Why those two? Well, because their state governments were strictly and deeply committed to the policy of land to the tiller. It just goes to show that a policy on paper requires serious political will to become reality on the ground.
Section 4. The Green Revolution.
Even with land ownership shifting, India desperately needed a massive technological leap just to feed its rapidly growing population. Before the Green Revolution, India was heavily reliant on importing food from the USA. But achieving that third goal, self-reliance, meant turning that completely around, becoming a nation where the Indian farmer could confidently wave off foreign grain traders because the country had finally achieved true self-sufficiency in food grains. This incredible agricultural miracle was entirely driven by high-yielding variety, or HYV, seeds. But man, these seeds were demanding. They required highly specific amounts of water, fertilizer, and pesticide. Because the setup cost was so high, the revolution had to be rolled out in two very distinct phases. Phase 1, running from the mid-60s to mid-70s, was mostly restricted to affluent states that already had good irrigation, like Punjab and Andhra Pradesh, and it really just focused on wheat. It wasn't until Phase 2, which stretched into the mid-80s, that the HYV technology successfully spread out to a wider variety of states and crops.
Now, a super crucial concept to grasp here is marketed surplus. Think about it. If farmers just ate all the extra food they grew, the national economy wouldn't really feel it. But because they produced so much extra, they had a massive marketed surplus to actually sell. This flooded the local markets with wheat and rice, which thankfully caused food prices to drop relative to other goods. And this was a phenomenal win for low-income groups, who were previously spending a massive chunk of their earnings just on trying to eat.
However, the Green Revolution definitely wasn't perfect, and the planners had to navigate some really severe risks. Initially, it seriously threatened the equity goal because it heavily favored wealthy farmers, literally the only ones who could afford the expensive fertilizers and irrigation systems that the HYV seeds demanded. On top of that, these new crops were way more vulnerable to pest attacks. That meant a small farmer who risked everything they had to adopt the new seeds could get entirely wiped out in a single bad season.
Which brings us to Section 5, the subsidy debate.
To manage those massive risks and actually help small farmers adopt HYV seeds, the government brought in agricultural subsidies. But wow, did this spark a debate. It's a debate that's still relevant. On one side, some economists argue that these subsidies need to be phased out. They point out that the technology is fully tested and profitable now. Plus, they argue it's a huge drain on government finances, and honestly, a lot of the money just ends up padding the fertilizer industry and already prosperous farmers rather than the intended target demographic. On the flip side, advocates passionately argue that we absolutely have to keep the subsidies. They point out that farming in India remains inherently unpredictable and risky, and without that financial support, poor farmers simply couldn't afford the inputs. Removing them would instantly widen the wealth gap and completely violate the national goal of equity.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this unresolved tension to ponder for yourself. We've seen exactly how India navigated some unbelievable challenges through bold central planning, shifting land ownership, and an outright technological revolution. But striking that perfect balance between growth and equity, that is an ongoing, continuous journey. So, based on the evidence we've looked at today, what do you think? Should these subsidies remain a permanent safety net to protect the vulnerable, or were they only ever meant to be a temporary stepping stone? It's a massive question, and it's one that continues to shape India's economic story even today.